Hello, welcome to this week's recording of the Revelation to John. We are in chapter 21, a little bit less than, or a little bit more than halfway through the chapter. We left off last time, I think, at verse 16 of 27 chapter verses. And I left you with this image of the New Jerusalem, which is unbelievable to our minds, and I don't know how John ever saw it in the vision, but it is said in verse 16 to be 12,000 stadia in length, as well as wide and high, and as it is long. Now, I think I translated that into modern measurements for you last week. That could mean almost 1,400 miles long, wide, and high. In other words, a 1,400 mile cube. Imagine a city that stretches approximately from Key West, Florida to Toledo, Ohio. That's huge. I don't know how we would imagine it, much less be able to see it in a vision. But John is looking at a city far beyond his comprehension, far beyond his powers to describe. So the best interpretation may have been, again, be just to not see literal measurements as the city, rather to see a city that's beyond our limited understanding. So I'm going to pause there, and if you haven't already read chapter 21, maybe you want to read it quickly or listen to it. Maybe you want to just refresh yourselves, let's say verses 15 through 27. And if you haven't already, please take time to go below this video on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. And if you're finding these videos helpful, maybe give me a thumbs up, and we can reach more people that way. Don't ask me how it works, just know that that's what I've been told. And I hope you are finding these beneficial. So, I don't know if I'll get done with the Revelation of John today. It may be one more. We'll see how long this one takes, which means we'll see how long I talk. So, picking up specifically verses 15 through 21 of chapter 21. The angel's measurement, which is enormous again, reveals that the city's great high wall, not just the city, but now the high wall, rises to a height of 144 cubits. Now that's modern day for Americans would be about 216 feet. Well, if you're comparing that wall, 216 feet, to the height of the city, 1,400 miles, it's not much of a wall by comparison. It would be impressive enough for an ordinary city, but it's ridiculously small for a city that's approximately 1,400 miles high. Consequently, the translation in the New International Version declares the measurement 144 cubits thick. Thick is not in there. That's the problem. It's unlikely for a couple of reasons. One, the first is the mention of the wall in verse 10 called attention to its great height. So it would be 144 cubits high, not thickness. Thickness indicates how strong the wall is or how impenetrable it would be. And two, the wall was not built for protection. The wall was not built to keep people out like we would think of in this world, because we've already been told that its gates are always open. So if you're planning to keep people out, you don't need a wall. The gates are already open. Verse 25. Moreover, the word thick is not in the text. So to put it in there as in the New International Version's translation, is reading something into the text that's not there. The text simply says 144 cubits. So I think the correct understanding would be talking about how high the wall is, not how thick it is. Despite the comparative modesty of 144 cubits versus 1,400 miles, the intended effect is to give us a sense of a great height. Consider one of us standing next to a wall that's 216 feet high. That's much taller than me, and I would expect much taller than you. The measurement is not given for the sake of a comparison with anything else. The great high wall, like the great and high mountain of verse 10, simply calls attention to the strange fact that this city is three-dimensional. It has height as well as length and width. Such numbers as 12,000 stadia and 144 cubits, I think, can recall for us the same number, or not the same, but similar numbers like 144,000 people in chapter 7 and 12,000 from each of the tribes of Israel, where we would read in chapter 7 verse 9, a great multitude that no one could count from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. So this huge cubical city has more than enough room, especially more than enough room for 144,000 from Israel, or even a crowd without number for all its nations, for all the nations. So that's the purpose of mentioning the size. It's not so we can build one. It's not so we can have a scaled down replica according to whatever measurements would allow us to see it. It's meant to encompass the whole people of God. It's meant to say it is so big, everybody can live there. And yet, in some sense, it's not about a building at all, just like the church is not about a building at all. It's about people. So in some sense, the New Jerusalem is not a city. It is the people of God, not a physical structure. So let's now move on. I know that was just kind of caught in the middle from last week's video to this one. But now we move on. Starting chapter 22, verses 22 through 27, we'll close out, 21. We're not closing out the book. We're closing out the chapter 21, verses 22 to 27. This time, John is not amazed or even beguiled by what he has seen as he was in chapter 17, verse 6. Nor does he need to have anything explained to him as he did in chapter 17, verses 7 through 18. As a prophet here, he's given the correct understanding to pass along to his readers. Curiously, the interpretation focuses more on what he does not see than what he sees. John sees no temple. And he concludes from this that the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple. Verse 22. There's no need of sun or moon, either as sources of light or as object of worship. No special feast are determined by the solar or the lunar calendar, no more cycle of day and night. Normally, the city's gates are open during the day and commerce and closed out for the night against an enemy attack. That's on this world. But in the New Jerusalem, there's no night there. Verse 25. The city's gates are always open. So far from being a fortress, the New Jerusalem is an open city without enemies. Compare that to chapter 20, verse 9. For its enemies are already in the lake of fire. See chapter 20, verse 15, and chapter 21, verse 8. So in short, John finds in this vision the realization of the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, sung by the redeemed in chapter 15. And I will take you back and remind you, chapter 15, verse 4 was, all nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. Here too, the hopes of the biblical prophets of Jerusalem have come true. Above all, Isaiah 60 verse 3 that reads, nations shall come to your light and kings to the brightness of your dawn. And Isaiah 60 verse 11, your gates shall always be open. Day and night they shall not be shut, so that nations shall bring you their wealth with the kings lading in procession. So John concludes his interpretation with a reminder that while Jerusalem is open to the kings of the earth and their splendor, verse 24, as well as to the glory and honor of the nations, in verse 26, it's not open to anything unclean, to anyone who practices abominations or falsehoods, according to verse 27. Only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life will enter the city. Now remember that sentence. Only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life will enter the city. The implication is both the residents of the city and the Gentiles, who John has seen bringing their wealth and their tribute into the city, are those who have been written into the Lamb's book of life. So John's vision includes the redemption of Christian saints and martyrs, and in some sense, the redemption of rebellious and previously deceived Gentile nations as well. That would be confusing to us, perhaps. For John, it seems absolutely normal. The two groups are allied in that both worship the God of Israel and the Lamb, although the precise relationship between the two groups is left up to our imagination. That takes us through chapter 21. If you've not already, you may wish to pause this video and read or listen to chapter 22 before this next section. So now we have come to the final chapter of the book of Revelation. Woo, it's been a while, hasn't it? Sorry about that, but I get wordy. I'll just own that. And this chapter gives us a vision of the river of life and its interpretation. So looking specifically verses 1 through 5. The second stage of John's vision begins with the words, "Then the angel showed me." In verse 1, compare that to chapter 21, verse 9 and verse 10. Having seen the holy city, John is now shown the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city, verses 1 and 2. And the great street is this wide main street of the city, emphasizing the river's centrality to the city as a whole and its visibility to all the residents of the city. The river of life irrigates the tree of life for the benefit of the city's inhabitants and the nations that live by its light, in verse 2, and compare that to chapter 21, verse 24. So just as the city has 12 gates and 12 foundations, the tree of life yields 12 crops of fruit. The difference here is that the 12 crops of fruit correspond to 12 months rather than to 12 tribes of Israel. Or in this text, or your text you're reading, it might say the 12 seasons of the year, but it means the 12 months. So the vision plays really on two biblical themes. The first, of course, is the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. You can read more about that in Genesis chapter 2, but specifically verse 9, to which Adam and Eve were denied access after the fall. And you can see that in chapter 3, but specifically chapter 3, verse 24. Also seen in Ezekiel's vision of water flowing down from the restored temple in Jerusalem all the way to the dead city. You can read on your own Ezekiel chapter 47, verses 1 through 12. John's tree of life is indeed located in a garden, but more precisely, John's tree of life is the garden. Yet the garden now stands at the heart of the city. In Ezekiel's vision, a river flows eastward from the temple in the city and outside through the gates of the city. You can see Ezekiel 47, verses 8 and 9, and verse 12. The shift from the vision of the river of the water of life, verses 1 and 2, to John's interpretation of it, verses 2 to 5, is even more abrupt than in the case of the vision of the holy city. John sees the river only within the New Jerusalem itself, and he links Ezekiel's tree lining the river flowing outside of the city with the tree of life from Genesis. So he is compiling some of the stories he likely was familiar with in the way he's describing the vision he sees. And instead of all kinds of trees lining up the river with all kinds of fruit, John is shown one kind of tree, which he calls the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of crops of fruit, presumably in the 12 months of the year for the city's inhabitants. Does the inhabitants of New Jerusalem in heaven need to eat? I don't know. John says there's going to be fruit there anyway. In Ezekiel, the leaves are for healing. In John's specific vision, they are for the healing of the nations. And again, I'll remind you, anytime you see the word nations, it's talking about the Gentile nations. So again, the tree of life is the reason why the bruised and battered Gentile nations will walk in the light of the holy city. And the kings of the earth will bring their splendor to it, according to chapter 21, verse 24. Whether or not they eat from the tree of life, according to chapter 2, verse 7, again, we're going way back, they clearly have a share in its benefits. You can see that in chapter 22, verse 14 and 19. In their own way, they are also redeemed. Or we may use the word rescued. Redeemed and rescued can mean they're synonymous in terms of the Greek and the Hebrew words. The remainder of John's interpretation, verses 3 through 5, mainly reinforces what was said earlier. No longer will there be any curse in the city, and no more night, just as there will be no more death or crying or pain, according to chapter 21, verse 4. So the point is much the same as in chapter 21, verse 17, where nothing impure, chapter 21, verse 27, where nothing impure is to enter the city. In a similar way, no more night, verse 5, echoes the language of chapter 21, verse 25, there will be no night there. Having already described the river of life flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb in verse 1, John now adds, somewhat belatedly, that the throne of God and the Lamb will be in the city. Oh yeah, by the way, with this river flowing from God's throne, that means God and the Lamb are in the city. He stated earlier that God and the Lamb are the city's temple or sanctuary, and now the temple is understood as the throne in the New Jerusalem, just as it was in heaven. You can see more about that in chapter 4 if you want to go back. John's mention of the throne as the temple affords John an opportunity to reflect briefly on the relationship between God and the people of God. John says, "And his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads." Verses 3 and 4. Compare that back to chapter 7, verse 15. "They are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple." At that point, there was a night. So for the first time in the entire book, John holds out the possibility of people seeing the face of God. Strictly speaking, that was contrary to Jewish belief. You can see that in Exodus chapter 33, verse 20. Also the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 18. Chapter 6, verse 46. And in the first letter of John, chapter 4, verse 12. So there are a variety of ways in which you can find that information in other Bible books. Yet there was also a strand within Judaism and the early Christian piety that allowed for such a possibility in a metaphorical sense. For example, Psalm chapter 11, verse 7, Psalm 17, verse 15, Psalm 42, verse 2, also Matthew chapter 8, verse 5, and the first letter of John chapter 3, verse 2. So metaphorically speaking, there are mentions of people being able to see the face of God. Perhaps this is what John is saying in this present passage from Revelation. To see God's face is to belong to God, to have God's name written on the foreheads. Compare again back to chapter 14, verse 1. And to live in the light of God's presence, compare back to chapter 21, verse 23. John's reflection on his vision ends with the declaration that the servants of God in the holy city will reign forever and ever, verse 5. The prophecy of the 24 elders that saints from every tribe and language and people and nation would reign on earth, according to chapter 5, verses 9 and 10, is not exhausted in that 1,000-year reign of chapter 20, verses 4 through 6. So the reign of the faithful, listed here, again, is passive. We don't rule as much as God and Jesus rule. They are the true king. The faithful, such as we consider ourselves, will be beside God and the Lamb as God rules over the new creation. Now this one's a little shorter. I'm going to stop there and we'll pick up again in chapter 22. I've taken you through verses 1 through 5. Might be a little frustrating, but I want you to process all of that, because I've been, let's jump back to this chapter, or let's move to this book of the Bible, or let's compare to this. Maybe you want to even go back and listen to this again and write some of that down and maybe do some research on your own. I always encourage you to do the research on your own. Don't just take my word for it. I try to do research because there's a whole lot of people out there much smarter than I am, especially much more learned in terms of biblical theology and Bible study. I rely on people. You should rely on the experts more than me as well. Thank you, though, for joining me. Next time, I promise, the next video next week, we will conclude the book of Revelation. Then I'll give you an idea of where I want to go from there, and hopefully you'll come along with me. If you happen to be in the Sun City Center area on Sundays, join us in person for worship at 10 a.m. If you are not and you can't join us in person, please join us online, this YouTube channel. We live stream at 10 a.m. starting Sunday mornings. And then the recording of the live stream goes on to our YouTube channel. You can pick up that anytime during the week or later. Again, thank you for joining me here again this week as we will soon conclude Revelation. I hope you're having a great week. Take care and God bless.